Hi everybody, I'm Courtney with Missouri Star Quilt Company, and I am here to show you a great project today. We're going to make this casserole cover using a June Tailor product. You can see here that I've done this in Christmas fabric, but keep in mind you can do it in any fabric you like and give these at any time of the year. I know I'm always looking for something to carry my casserole dishes in when I go to a potluck. And instead of grabbing my nasty pot holders out of the kitchen cupboard, now I have a great casserole carrier. The other thing you can do is when you're ready to leave the potluck, just go ahead and leave the casserole carrier and use it as a gift. So let's go through the supplies that you're going to need. So what you're going to need for your supplies are, for the top of your casserole carrier, you're going to need 1/4 yard of each of 6 fabrics. Or if you have 17 5-inch squares laying around and 6 pre-cut 2.5-inch strips, you can go ahead and use those as well. For the strap and the binding, you're going to need 2/3 yard of fabric. For the backing fabric, you're going to need 1 yard. And then additional supplies that you're going to need: 4 inches of hook and loop tape, which I like to call Velcro, and 1 2/3 yards of a 1-inch cotton webbing for the handles. And you also are going to need a basting product. So let's get started. So you can see here, this is what your casserole carrier is going to look like when you take it out of the bag. A nice flat piece of batting. It's got your markings on it where we're going to sew. The first thing you want to do is you're going to baste this to your backing fabric. Now I'm going to tell you what I did, which is not what the June Tailor people recommend. The day I was going to do my project, it was very windy outside, so I did not want to deal with spray based. So there's a great product out that's a powder called Quilter's Select Free Fuse, and that is an iron-on product. What they tell you, what June Tailor tells you, is that cotton batting can shrink when you put an iron on it. So I was a little hesitant, but I was so desperate to get the project started, I thought, I'm just going to try it. So I laid my backing fabric down, I shook my fuse powder on the backing, and then I laid my batting down. I flipped it over, and from the fabric side I ironed, and it came out just beautifully. I did not have any shrinking. Now, I sort of want to say do as I say, not as I did. But the one thing you can do to test to see if the fuse powder will work for you, go ahead and cut out one of the pieces of your June Tailor product that does not have any markings on it. You're going to draw a 4-inch square, or any size square, it doesn't matter. Then go ahead and fuse that product using the Quilter's Select. Fuse it to your backing, and then turn it over and measure that 4-inch square to see if it shrank. If it didn't shrink, you'll know that you're good to use it on the rest of your product. If it did shrink, then don't use the powder. Just go ahead and spray and use a spray based. After you have your project all sprayed or glued to your backing, you'll see on your project that there is this dashed line that runs all the way around. You are going to sew on this line using a large basting stitch, and make sure that you use a thread that contrasts with your backing fabric. Ask me how I know this. The first time I did one of the June Tailor projects, I had my bobbin thread all filled with thread ready to match the backing because I knew I was going to be quilting this. And I went to, when it was time to trim it, I couldn't see the thread because the thread matched the fabric. So I would use a cream thread in here or a white just at this part of the project. And then once we're done basting this line, you're going to switch your bobbin thread out and you're going to put a thread in that matches your backing fabric. So let's get our edges basted down. You will notice on the machine that I have a walking foot on. And what a walking foot does is, it's a little bulky thing, but what it does is it evenly feeds all of your fabrics through the foot. So I just have 2 layers here, which is just your batting and the backing. But I found that by using this foot through my whole casserole cover, it really helped keep all of my layers of fabric straight. If you do not have a walking foot, don't worry about it. Just use your regular foot, your 1/4-inch foot. But I really did find if you do have a walking foot, I recommend you use it. And I have my stitch set on about a 3, 3.5, and I'm just going to follow that line all the way around. So I'm all done going around the outside of my casserole caddy. I'm going to lay it down. Now what this line, why we had to do this is going to become our trimming line when we go to put our binding on. Now, the one thing that I did go back and do before I started sewing on my pieces is we're going to go ahead and cut some of this off. It makes it easier. You don't have as much bulk to go through the machine. So then you're not pulling the whole caddy base through, you're just putting through with the parts you need. So just go ahead and, this is scrap, you can use it maybe figure out how to use it for pot holders or something later. So you can just go ahead and trim this off. Okay, so now we are ready to start to piece our caddy. So June Tailor products, I love it. They have everything numbered, and they're numbered in the order that you have to sew it, okay? So we're going to start with number 1, and I'm going to get my 5-inch square, and then we are going to start putting pieces across the middle here. So let me grab my squares and I'll show you how to start sewing. So on mine, I just laid these down in any random order. You could go through, obviously, and lay them out before you start sewing where you want everything so you know what strips will be where. I was trying to be a little freeform, so I just picked up squares and started sewing. Okay, so there's my number 1 square, and that should be centered between those 2 blue lines, and it sure is. And then here's my number 2. So I am going to lay this square right sides together there, and I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam right down that edge. So I'm going to flip this over. I'm going to fold this up a little bit so it's easier to get under the machine. Now I know where a 1/4 inch is on my walking foot. I know it's on the inside of this little hole right here. If you need to mark, if you're using a walking foot that doesn't have a mark, you might need to mark it with a little bit of a Sharpie so you know where the 1/4 inch is. Or if you've been doing this a while, you can probably pretty much gauge where the 1/4 inch is. There's no need to backstitch because your stitching will be covered by the next set of fabrics. So I'm just ready to go here. Turn your stitch length back to shorter. I've got it on about a 2. You can feel free to pin these. If these are moving on you a little bit, if your fabrics are moving, just go ahead and put a pin in, that's no problem. So there's my number 2. So you just lay it flat. I wouldn't iron at this point. You can just finger press that. And now we jump over to do number 3. So I'll grab a fabric, right sides together, flip it so my 1/4 inch is on the correct side of my machine, and we'll do the next one. And my 3 is done. And this is all you're going to do for the whole process. Go back to 4, 5, 6, and 7. Then you're going to go down here. These go to 9. You'll do your 10, 11, 12, and 13. Those are your 2.5 inch strips. Once you get to number 14, I just wanted to point this out. This is a little different than what we've been doing. You need to sew 4 squares together in one long strip first and put those on as one piece here. But that's the only time you need to do that. Everything else, like these, we pieced one by one. This one you'll go together, sew your 4 squares together and use that as one unit, as unit number 14, and it's the same on the other side. Once you get all of your pieces on, you are going to go back through, and I went ahead and top stitched around the edges of my fabric are. Let me show you how I did that. So I went back with just my black thread again, and I just ran a stitch around, and this is just holding this down until I cut my piece, my caddy, along those lines that we sewed from the back. So once I went around my whole caddy, then I flipped it over, and now you can see this nice cream stitching. It's still a little hard to see, but it's easier to see than the black, right? And now we're going to trim this really nicely right up next to that stitching. And here's where you want to be a little more precise than how we trimmed earlier. And this is just getting the caddy ready for binding. Okay, and you will do this around the whole caddy. And then let's talk about our binding. As you see on my casserole cover, I sewed my binding on the back side, brought it around to the front, and then I did a nice little decorative stitch on the front. I don't have time normally to hand stitch. Bless all you people that do all that hand stitching and love it. And I do love it at times, but at this time of year especially, I don't have time to hand stitch. So I'm always looking for a little bit quicker way to do it. The machine worked beautifully. I again used my walking foot, and I used this great decorative stitch. Now keep in mind when you're cutting the binding for your caddy that it needs to be on the bias. And it needs to be on the bias because you have these curves in here. And if you didn't have this on the bias, it'd be really tricky to get around those curves. So that's why they want you to do the bias binding, and I found it worked beautifully. And I just started and stopped just like you do with any binding on any quilt project. Once you have your binding attached, you're ready to make the carrier holder straps, and let's go over how to do that. So they have you make a tube of fabric. So this is just a tube of the width that they had you cut. The first thing they want you to do is go through and press one edge over, about a 1/2 inch. So I just went through and pressed this with my iron. On the other side, you're going to take your webbing, you're going to cut it at an angle, and you're going to flip it over, and you're going to come in about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of that webbing, and you're going to just run a top stitch all along that edge. Once you do that, you'll flip it over like this. You'll flip it over onto itself, and voila, there is your webbing. They have you, when you get to the other end, what they tell you to do is cut. Now you're going to cut this opposite there. Once you get and you see how it goes together, that's how you'll finish that webbing in there. But as I said, this will be just like this, and then go ahead and run a top stitch down either side about 1/8 of an inch in to give that a nice pretty finish. Then you're ready to attach it to the cover. So here you can see how I attached mine. They'll show you, there's a diagram in your printout that shows you exactly how to place this. I ran a stitch. I used a red here. I put it in just for a little extra pop. And I stitched about 1/8 of an inch in, stitched it to the cover. And then I also went over a second time to make sure that the handles are secure to the caddy and that the caddy will hold up under a little bit of weight in case you have a good heavy lasagna in there. You don't want these handles to break. So that's all ready to go. Then you'll get out your Velcro or hook and loop tape if you're fancy. And you'll sew, I believe it's a 4-inch piece. On this side, again, I used my walking foot. You'll sew the other piece to the other side, making sure that they match and they're not off center. And your caddy is finished and ready to give to your recipient or ready for you to use. I hope you had fun making your casserole caddy with Missouri Star Quilt Company.
We hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you are not already part of the Missouri Star Quilt family, you can hit the subscribe button below so you won't miss a thing. And if you click that bell, it'll notify you every time a new tutorial comes out. See you next Friday.